Hi, my name is John Alexander. I'm the Senior Director of Technical Product Marketing for Orca Security. And just give an intro, we're going to have Andy Ellis be the Master of Ceremonies for this panel. Just wanted to give a little bit of a quick 1-minute intro on Orca. Part of what we do is educating our customers, but our main thrust has been be able to find Log4j. And I've been an operator for a little while, and I know what it's like to be in the hot seat whenever you get these big logoed vulnerabilities that come up, and you've got your manager hovering over you every 10 minutes asking you what's going on. So, and we live that as well on our end. And I think the big thrust for us was two things. One is the visibility to be able to monitor every VM, every workload out there, and we can do that at Orca. But the other part of it was this was a tricky vulnerability, Log4j. Finding the base version of it was pretty simple, but it could hide inside of these different archives, right? We all know that. So we actually scrambled to write custom code on our end so that we could go and dig in and go through the different nesting levels to find every instance of Log4j, because that's what everybody cares about, trust, right? You want to be able to trust your system. You want to be able to tell your manager, we got this, and that's kind of where we're going. And then the last thing, just on the education front, we figured, hey, let's kind of beef this up. We have contacts with a lot of luminaries, those that are in this panel, and let's see what they learned, see what their best practices were. So given that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Andy Ellis, our virtual CISO for Orca. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, John. And first of all, I want to thank all my presenters for joining us here today. So I'll introduce everybody while we've got their names up here, and then we'll just go to the big grid view so you can actually see our facial expressions and the wry turns of face we get when we discuss difficult topics. So our guest today starts with Helen Patton, who's an advisory CISO at Cisco. As you see, Helen and I have the same title at different companies. That's because I thought she had such an amazing gig that I wanted one for myself. We've got Ralph Pine, who's the VP of Security at Nextrol. And we have Jack Rohrig, who is the CISO at Booknook, and CSO at Booknook. And Jack has, I think, the honor of currently being the shortest tenured CSO in the industry, having just started very, very recently. So first of all, thank you all for joining us here today. So let's start with a conversational prompt, which is, a lot was made of these celebrity vulnerabilities back in, I think it was 2013, it became this big thing. We had Heartbleed, we had Shell Shock. Then a few years later, we get Spectre, we get Meltdown. I'm skipping over Oracle and Poodle and all the other things. And now we're on Log4j. So have we learned anything from celebrity vulnerabilities? And if so, what do you think we've learned and put into practice?
Yeah, I learned from Log4j that sometimes they actually have a very substantial impact, and not to ignore celebrity vulnerabilities or trademark vulnerabilities because of the precedent that was set prior to that. When Log4j dropped, I was like, great, the execs picked up the journal again. I don't know what this is, And then I looked into it and very quickly dropped everything and worked on it for weeks.
Yeah, I think my position on this is I'm not sure we've learned anything per se. I think that things have definitely changed. And so, big changes from, almost a decade ago is the technologies in use. So, Docker, AWS, and so on has, changed the way that we're doing patching, and the move from like centralized operations to DevOps has meant that firstly, you have to touch a lot more places. It's much easier to patch, but it's much more of a coordination project management task than it ever was.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, the history of vulnerability management and patching has prepared us to have processes in place to deal with this. And then we have to deal with the uniqueness of the individual issue of the day. I think the interesting thing about Log4Shell was a lot of people in the industry kind of went, we don't have a really great way of identifying where it is, and then we've got multiple ways of mitigating it when we find it, and then we're also really reliant on our vendors to be able to help us with that, which is always true, but this was in sort of a multi-directional way. And this was an open source library the root of it that didn't have anybody that we could really go and poke on really hard to say, go fix this thing. So there were multiple layers of weirdness and complexity on this one that I think our regular response processes were a little bit strained to be able to handle it. And we're still seeing sort of the long tail of it now. We see this with some of the other previous vulnerabilities as well, but I think we're going to see a longer tail with this one. So I'll be interested to watch it over the next few months and see where it goes.
Yeah, I think you've nailed something there, Helen, about sort of the complexity of this one and maybe how hard it was to understand. Like when we talked about Heartbleed, we're like, oh, OpenSSL leaks keys. Like, boom, that's like 4-word description of what's going on, and everybody knew what OpenSSL was. And if I combine that with Jack's take, where it's like, oh, the other executives told me about it because they read about it in the journal, right? So is there this model that is like, we don't know as CISOs, like how to coherently communicate something, maybe because we don't even know about it yet. By the time an executive comes and asks us about it, do you think that CISOs tend to sort of become defensive and maybe not take it quite as seriously just because they're like, oh, the marketing has outstripped the technical piece of it?
Can I jump in on that one? So I call that the Financial Times effect. So when I worked in London in financial services, I always read the Financial Times on a Sunday to know what the execs are going to ask me on Monday morning and be prepared. I don't think, certainly that's not my viewpoint on things. I think if something is serious enough that an exec it's going to be in the public perception, I am absolutely going to make sure that I have my story straight on it so I can communicate to the executive and the board when they come ask those questions. So if anything, the brand of it makes me take it more seriously because I know that there's going to be scrutiny around it.
Okay.
I think there's some it's perception versus what you're actually doing, right? I think that the Log4j highlighted something, that this problem has always existed. And I know, we're here with Orca, and Orca is one of the technologies that's really given us visibility ubiquitously into the infrastructure, which demonstrated that what CISOs have been screaming about for over a decade, that these problems exist. We have evidence now, right? So when we had like a Financial Times vulnerability that was disclosed, a lot of times in the past, I would know that we weren't vulnerable. Like, it'd be very easy for me to prove because the attack surface was very small and easy to audit.
Yep.
Log4j is not the case, right? Because it was called Log4Shell, and then this vulnerability popped up, and that one, and this other one, and some dude in Alberta's maintaining the project or whatever. It was the nightmare. But I really think it's about perception. In the previous ones, I definitely attested to the security of our infrastructure, customers. I did the diligence. It's just there was far less diligence to do, and I didn't need to be as thorough because it wasn't this severe a risk.
Yeah. I think this one also, look, I'll be honest, I had never heard of Log4j. So I'd love your question to know how many of you actually knew about Log4j before this vulnerability?
No.
Yeah, that's basically like, and yet it seems to be ubiquitous. Like this is almost like SolarWinds all over again. Like SolarWinds had 80% market penetration of the Fortune 500, and like a handful of CISOs even knew who they were.
Log4j probably had more penetration than SolarWinds.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it was in more things and in more esoteric pieces of infrastructure. It was everywhere. It demonstrates the complexity of the operating systems that we run.
Yep.
But I also think, while that's true, I think if you look at the press uptake on Log4Shell, it was, here's a really big vulnerability, and then it was sort of crickets. Whereas SolarWinds and others was, here's this thing, and here is the impact. And so I never had an executive come to me and ask me about a vulnerability that wasn't accompanied by impact. And we really haven't seen a lot of the reporting around the impact side of this equation yet, even now. So this one was a little bit different in terms of front page editorializing from the media.
Yep.
Again, I'm waiting to see the long tail of it and see who really gets whacked. And then whoever gets whacked will be, chastised for not acting faster. So
yeah, it almost feels like some of the denial of service vulnerabilities that I've seen in the past, like HashDOS or Slow Loris, that were real, but like if you weren't like narrowly in that space, they never really took off, and the impact was a lot more unclear.
That's right.
Okay, we're going to push a poll out to our viewers right now, so they can participate a little bit about where have you found Log4j? Have you found all of it? But here's the prompt for the panelists. which is, what are the weirdest places you've heard about or that you personally have found either Log4j or an exploit payload? Maybe it didn't actually hit Log4j, but it was an interesting place. So tell me some more stories.
So I don't have stories, so I'll go first. So it gives everybody else time to think about the question. I actually went and spoke to my threat intel folks here where I work, and they said there was nowhere they were surprised to see it because they expected it to be everywhere given the nature of the library. So the question of where were you surprised, everyone was like, well, it's everywhere. Maybe it was the fact that it was everywhere was sort of surprising, but not to be unexpected.
Yeah, and so we were kind of lucky in this, is that we don't use a lot of Java. And so it was more around, products that are in use, right? But a couple of interesting things I've heard was someone had a Ruby package, which was a Java wrapped in Ruby, which had Log4j in it, which is kind of an interesting one that you wouldn't obviously pick up at a first surface level scan. I think this also speaks to the complexity of finding it. So we ran multiple scanners. We built our own, we ran Inspector, and we used Orca, and we found different levels of depth from the different tools. And ultimately, Orca, get a little pitch, did do better than everyone else in terms of the depth it went to. But yeah, we, certainly superficially, it was hard to find. In terms of interesting stuff coming in, we saw, it was really interesting to see. So again, we've got people in Europe. So within a couple of hours of an announcement, we already had WAF rules in place. So again, very low impact from our perspective. But we saw some really interesting stuff in terms of where people were trying, right? So one of the more interesting places we saw it was actually in a user agent string, which was, I think the intention was to drop it into logs, but kind of picked up our analytics service, for example. And so when we subsequently went out, we did discoveries like, hey, where would all these payloads be? We found it that place. And I think this was a very interesting thing about this attack that's different from everything else and kind of changed my risk thinking a little bit, is like, we tend to think like, internet accessible, PII, etc.
Yep.
But this was like, hey, this could get anywhere, right? And so, the risk calculus that we normally would use to prioritize vulnerability management was completely turned on its head by this particular attack.
Jack, did you find it anywhere weird?
I got to go with Helen's answer was perfect. It's exactly what I was thinking. It's like, it was everywhere. I mean, it just everywhere. But that's an interesting phenomenon, right? Because a lot of the controls that we have in place and a lot of the things that we do to mitigate the risk of the vulnerabilities being introduced into our environments wouldn't have caught this, didn't catch this. There's not much it could have done. It was everywhere, right? And Ralph mentioned that it kept on growing. People kept on discovering more and more code. I mean, statically linked all over the place, right? Like every day, Orca was alerting me of new detections, and we weren't deploying new things. It was just this thing is bizarrely ubiquitous.
Yep.
But it's also interesting to hear. I never really thought about the impact. I haven't heard much about major impact of this one, which you think. I mean, there'd be a huge amount of impact, but maybe I just haven't heard about it.
You would. And I think Ralph's on an interesting point around what internet facing means, or internet accessible, is we're used to thinking about either applications that accept input from the internet or occasionally libraries that process data formats. Like I know that when I was at Akamai, we had our top 10 most dangerous libraries, which included libxml, libpng, right? All of the image and data processing formats. But log processing is one I don't think we've thought about. Now, I heard a story, but it was on Twitter, so of course it must be true, of someone who found actually an exploited system because they were monitoring for callouts. And the exploited system was their physical badge reader that somebody had put the string encoded as a RFID on the badge reader. And so it grabbed the payload and tried to call out. Now, that might or might not be apocryphal. I found it at least entertaining. And certainly, to Helen's threat intel's team's point, that's not entirely surprising that could be an attack vector at this point. Before I jump on to my next question, if you're in the audience and would like to ask a question, if you drop it into the question system here on Bright Talk, I'll see that and incorporate that into our question thread as we go forward. But so sort of the next one here is, I want to talk about shift left and shift right, which are sort of the two big hot topics, certainly in the vendor world, about, where do you go? And we talk about it in DevOps, whether you're going shift left towards dev or shift right towards ops. So when you think about a vulnerability like this, that is just endemic across environments, but it sort of feels like a pandemic because it's urgent and a crisis, we have to deal with it now. Do you think more about focusing right and on operations, or left on the development process to harden and secure things? And how does that play out tactically? Like, what do you actually do differently coming out of something like this?
I don't think there's much we could have done from shifting to the development focus. Certainly, some controls into the SDLC or to source code commits or whatever would have caught a lot of this stuff. But I think personally, my opinion is that shifting left in the development lifecycle to get ahead of security vulnerabilities, while it may be proactive, is expensive and generally ineffective. There's a lot of opportunity in this space right now to develop solutions to that, and hopefully that it's going to get better. But right now, when I'm building a greenfield program, which I've done many times, I don't start with AppSec. I don't start with the development lifecycle. That would be ridiculous. It's insanely expensive. The amount of risk that it mitigates is low, but it's certainly something that requires some priority. And I think that there's some tooling out there that makes it pretty easy. But really, I think it's more of a cultural phenomenon. If you get people excited about security, especially in the development world, they're going to develop more things more securely. They're going to pay more attention to it, and you're going to mitigate the most amount of risk for the least price.
Well, I'd say other than, so I think in terms on the AppSec side, so we are very focused on that at Nextrol, and I think that this was a vulnerability in things that are supplied to us. It's it's a supply chain issue ultimately, and so the one good thing about a robust AppSec program, it may tell us where the code is more quickly, but realistically it's not going to help us, right? So it's all the traditional security stuff like compartmentalization, egress filtering, all of the other stuff that kind of isn't as popular now as it perhaps once was in a more DevOps orientated world, is the stuff that saves you, right? So again, I think that it continues to say, back to basics, that you just have to do the basic security stuff well. Like, that's when something completely new comes around. It's those kind of basic, simple controls that save you.
Yeah. I think for me, it was at an organizational level, it's more of a shift right for all the reasons that I think you got to do your processes, your detection response capabilities, those kinds of things. I think the other thing that this raises for us as a security community too, though, is, are we taking care of our ubiquitous shared libraries, our open source environments, our open source maintenance to the degree that we should? I think there's been just a willingness to accept stuff coming in our supply chain without really paying close enough attention to it. And I don't think it's a scalable solution for every company to ramp up their third-party software development testing program. I think this is something that lends itself to a community effort, and if we get it right, it'll raise all boats. So I'm interested to see what the security community at large does to help with this, because I think it's a community response.
I think that's a really good point. And we've been having a lot of conversations about SBOMs, software bill of materials. And I've been a big fan of internal SBOMs. Like, you as a company should know what is in all of your software, but not so much the external ones about people trying to publish those, partly because they're very arcane and confusing and misleading, and you'll have ugly conversations, and partly because I don't want companies to rely on them. Like, imagine if in something like with the Log4Shell, if you said, oh, well, let me pull all of the SBOMs from all of my vendors and integrate them to figure out which ones have Log4j and then publish that out, versus, no, I actually inspect everything I do. So I'd love your take on, specifically, like, what should we be doing next, or what should companies be doing next to really get a handle on what vulnerabilities and what libraries they actually have in their environments, not just cloud, but they have the legacy environment as well. Is that too big a question? Nobody wants to tackle that one.
I'll jump in. So I'm with you, Andy. I think there is as all things security tend to do, I think we've got to go back to our asset management processes and see if they're granular enough and dynamic enough to be able to handle a similar kind of event in the future. And if they're not, to close those gaps. It's not just a matter of scanning and sucking into your CMDB of choice. We are going to have to get more granular. We are going to have to, at some level, rely on our vendors to help us with the ingredients of the products that we're using, and to be able to manage that. One of the challenges with SBOMs, whether it's an internal SBOM or an external one, is how do you operationalize the information that's there when you've got it? To your point, having a vendor publish an SBOM list and then my Intel team or my SecOps team then leveraging that for playbooks, for automated response, those kinds of things. There's a lot of engineering that's going on there, both process engineering as well as just, machine learning engineering. So we're going to need some help with that kind of stuff. So
Yep.
I think there is an opportunity to rethink and redouble down on our asset management capabilities and how it feeds into our automated incident response, detection response capabilities here.
And I think that, it would be useful. It's a part of the process, but I think, the key thing that, I'm always driving is that we need to get better at these vulnerability management processes in general. So, this was a high profile one, but, we're certainly in next role, we're dealing weekly with new issues arising from, from our bug bounty programs, from pen tests, from reports, from scans that we're getting, all this kind of stuff. And it's, the key is being able to just react quickly. So, again, I think it all goes back to like just having the right process in place. So when something like this rolls around, it's not a big shock.
Yeah. And Ralph and I used to work together a few years back. Ralph, did you work on any acquisitions with me back at IC? You did, right? Yep. I mean, I've done a ton since then. And one of the things that I've noticed is that vulnerability management posture of the companies that I've acquired is always bad. Always. Yep. It's like not hard, it's not a very expensive thing to implement, but it's something that people are very averse to. And I think that the discovery of those vulnerabilities a lot of times isn't enough. I don't know the solve, right? I think there's a lot of it is cultural, like company culture wise, but Ralph, you're running a bug bounty program. I never built a bug bounty program because I didn't believe that I'd be able to handle the amount of requests that came in, that I'd have the bandwidth. And a smaller company, of course. But that's one of those things where I wish I knew the magic button I had to push to get people to take vulnerabilities seriously. But that shit happened even with Log4j. We were discovering some pretty high risk vulnerabilities, and it was kind of like, y'all need to take this seriously. We have customers. They did. That was a lot easier to motivate because I had the evidence. But it's indicative of a problem that I think is not unique to any of our companies. I think it's pretty, technology wide.
Yeah, I have a hypothesis on that, Jack, which is companies that are still startups, right, that haven't yet turned a profit and don't have line of sight to being wildly successful are more like zombies than humans, right? As a human, large company, you are actually aware of your own mortality, but it's like far out in the future. You think you're immortal, and therefore there are risks you're just not going to take. Like, if you're hungry for lunch, you're not going to think, oh, let me go do a parkour course that might break my leg just to be able to eat lunch. Like, I can skip a meal. It's not the end of the world. If you're a zombie that is dying but for brains, totally it is the right thing to do to risk breaking a leg to eat, because if you don't eat right now, you're just dead. And in the same fashion, there are risks that smaller companies are more likely to take because they're at risk of dying. And if they try to negate risks that aren't dying, they're more likely to die because they run out of money sooner.
I think it depends on the trend of the company too.
Yep.
The older mid-sized companies that are dying on the vine take substantial risks and don't want to know about them.
Right. I think there's a mindset of, I don't want to know how bad it could be because it's already pretty bad.
I've actually seen a better in my acquisition life, several dozen acquisitions. I've actually seen better security postures at tiny startups, because people are so intimidated by the concept of security. They think that they need to embed it everywhere. And especially in education, Amazon actually, if you're an ed tech startup, Amazon, I believe, offers free security services. Yeah. It's, I think that for the larger companies, we have a better systems and processes in place, but only, the companies that are trending up or massive.
I do wonder how much of this is the cloud has changed this simply because you can consume security now in ways that you used to not be able to. And you can just take advantage of what other people have built, which unfortunately sometimes is Log4j and comes with some built-in vulnerabilities as well.
I actually think cloud has made it more difficult for some of us. So my boss, Wendy Nather, talks about the security poverty line.
Yep.
And a lot of what contributes to the security poverty line is tech debt. And so if you're a cloud native startup, glad to be you. Good job. Click that button, check that box, job done. And if you're like the rest of us and you've got medical devices still attached to Windows 95 machines because you can't otherwise get an FDA approval to run the MRI, or whatever your vertical is, the older the stuff that you've got to carry, the harder it is to patch, the harder it is to keep updated, and the older and less likely it is your documentation's likely to be. So again, going back to, does this use the Log4j library? Well, let me pull that manual out from propping up my bookcase, and I'll see if it's got something in there that might reference it. It's almost impossible, and that's why I think we continue even now to see so many Log4j vulnerabilities still out in the wild.
Yep.
We've got tech debt that can't be patched, and so what do you do with that? And network segmentation gets you so far, but it doesn't get you all the way. So what now?
Yeah, and that does bring back the question of why haven't we seen more exploits and why aren't they being talked about? Because Log4j has been vulnerable for a long time and used for a long time. And it has to be in some medical devices that can't get an update at this moment. Why are we not hearing about it? And the best thing I can come up with is, at the heart, it is a remote compromise. Boom, you get root on a machine, but there have been a lot of vulnerabilities like that, and a lot of botnets have been created, and nobody often talks about the machines themselves that got compromised.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe we're just not hearing about them because those specific machines haven't had secondarily really bad outcomes. It hasn't been an MRI machine that has killed somebody inside it. Hopefully never, but we'll say not yet for now. So let's talk about the role of a CISO. And I think, Ralph, you sort of alluded to being prepared. But you get this celebrity vulnerability, even if it's not a celebrity, but a big thing that's going to be across your platform. What is it like in those first few days after Log4j? How do you think about communications with risk, security, DevOps, marketing, customers? How are you managing team fatigue, burnout? Let's walk through the process of being a CISO in this long-running vulnerability situation. Can you guys hear Ralph? Because I can't. Okay.
It was an audio issue.
I thought it was a listening issue on my end, Ralph.
Sorry, I've got it.
Oh, there we go. Now you're back.
It's my fault. So yeah. I think, the starting point is, you initially get the piece of information that, hey, there's a potential issue. So for me, that was I wake up in the morning, check my Slack first thing, as I always do. Something's boiled up overnight. Now, I was lucky, as I said, because my team is awesome. They already jumped on it. And so by the time that I got it, they'd already notified the engineers. We already had some inventory in place. We'd already blocked on our WAF, so I was like, this is great. I don't have to do anything. But basically, so then my job comes is just really assessing where the level is, exec communication. So we went out, communicated with the engineering leadership, I pinged the CEO, this kind of thing, just to say we're on it. You're probably hearing about this, or you will hear about this, but we're on it. And then it's going from there. It's just, what's the remediation plan, the amount of time, customer comms, all of that kind of stuff. So it's for us, it was a pretty quick cycle. And for me, I'm in this very lucky position now. I've been in my role for a while. I built an awesome team, and my team handled it, right? So where I was at was just really in that position of communicating with stakeholders, be those customers or executives, and the team just ran with the issue. Some challenges we ran into was really around hey, this is, this is something we need to go deal with, and it's in a lot of places, right? So normally we'll have a vulnerability and it will be like in one service, and we're like, hey, we need to go fix that one thing, and that's easy. The issue here was, like, to Jack's point of, like, it's in a lot of places. And so one of the things that we had to do was work with our product team. And this, I think, is, again, different from some of these other headline things because of the penetration of it. We had to go communicate with the product team and say, hey, you're going to lose a week's worth of, productivity or effort as we work with a bunch of the engineering teams to resolve that issue. So that was actually the hardest conversation that we had to have, was just on, that communication out to product, who were great about it, by the way, and no arguments. But, that was the thing, again, that was slightly differentiated from our conventional. Like, normally a vulnerability is like, hey, we need to go fix this in 3 places. This was like, we need to go fix it in hundreds of places. So a different level of effort.
And can I say that's amazing? You got we're going to take away a week of your developers. And like, they were like, okay, like, if we have to, we have to. Like, I think that's every CISO's dream.
Yeah, and Nextdoor is an awesome company, so and especially from a security perspective. So yes, we're very product and engineering focused, and so it wasn't a big challenge.
Yep.
Also, Ralph is like 6'4".
That's the problem on these Zoom and webinars, is you can never tell how tall somebody really is. Yeah, Helen's now 7 feet tall.
Yeah, I think that the post-mortem analysis was really where I spent most of my time. And not trying to figure out blast radius and all that kind of nonsense, but really trying to assess how we could have done things better, and trying to vocalize to the leadership and the decision makers that we probably should have done this, we should have done that, and changing our processes, that sort of stuff. And also self-reflection, because for the first 30 minutes of hearing about Log4j, I was like, another one of these. Like, my team will take care of it, fine. And my team did the tactics, they did the work. They handled it very well. The developers handled it very well, but they took it very seriously. The incident triage was not kicked off the way I would have liked it to have been kicked off, and that it's very crucial to get that done right at inception. Otherwise, things can transcend into chaos. If we hadn't had the proper tooling in place, and Orca, of course, was one of those key tools, we would have been real. We would have had some real problems. And there were some other tools, some real-time detection system. I actually don't get hands-on very often, and I use a tool called Confluera that is bizarrely powerful. And in our environment, it was consuming 20 billion. I think it was 20 billion events that it recorded to a database and stored for 30 days or 90 days or something across an infrastructure of like 3,000 hosts. And so I was in there extremely granular. I was looking at all kinds of data, and I wasn't finding a whole lot of Log4j payloads, but I was finding a whole lot of other stuff. Right. So for me, the role of the CISO it changed my perspective a little bit. I hate to admit it, but it did. And the postmortem analysis, and all these types of events is something that is momentum that needs to be harnessed, and not something that needs to be brushed under the rug.
Yeah, I just want to say, Jack, I think every CISO has that story, even if we don't always talk about them publicly, of when something came to our attention and we blew it off. And sometimes it is years later that you realize how big of a thing you blew off. Like, I'll give mine. Like, when I was at Akamai, we had a system that just checked for our users reusing SSH keys, because they were supposed to rotate them on a regular basis. And one day we had 2 users who had never talked to one another, lived on different sides of the planet, had the same SSH key. And like, we started to investigate it. We couldn't figure out what was going on. And like, weird, not malfeasance. And finally we said, fine, like, it is possible that they randomly generated the same SSH key. As horribly unlikely as it is, it has to happen to somebody, right? And it turns out that they were using a version of Debian that not a lot of people used in our company, but that was the version of Debian where they had zeroed out the OpenSSL memory right before key generation, and there were only 1,000 possible keys to generate, which 2 years later, the rest of the world learns about. And I'm like, I blew it off. Like, I had all the evidence that told me that, key collision was a real thing, and ignored it. So don't worry about it.
That's nothing. Come on, we've all made worse mistakes. And I mean, in my personal life, security-wise, right? If you look at things, growing up through the years, I've done some dumb stuff, made just some real dumb stuff, and that's awesome, because I own that, learn from it, right?
Yep.
And if we don't really reflect on the dumb stuff that we've done, we don't grow. That humility is what makes us excellent people.
Yep.
So yeah, I think that, you bring up a good point, right? We need to be candid about our screw ups and be very skeptical of somebody who never screws up.
Yep.
I think the other thing about this particular event, it's not just the security teams going around fixing stuff, it's the IT teams as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so this really, I think, tested the strength of those relationships, because we're all just sort of fatigued from vulnerability after vulnerability after vulnerability after COVID after vulnerability. Like, we're already sort of chewed up and spat out, and then this happened. And of course it does, because these kinds of things always happen over a holiday break or a long weekend, or when everyone's like, this is the weekend where I get to actually have dinner with my family, and then no, not again, not this one. And so I think we're all dealing with workforce depletion issues at the moment, and then you layer on something like this that isn't easily containable, that isn't one part of the business, it's sort of all parts of the business, and everyone you touch is sort of like, oh, like this is just like I'm just getting ground down. And so part of the lessons learned post-mortem, I think, for all of us should be, are we taking care of our staff? Are there other things that need to be coming off their plates? Because it's Log4j tomorrow, it's log something else, next week, and it'll be something else again the following week. And we keep going back to the same people to fix it. And that's not sustainable. So how do we manage that? I think we all need to be introspective about that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, right? Like, just say no.
Yeah.
Right?
We're not going to patch anything. Doesn't quite work though to just say no.
Like, look, I've built processes for a living, right? Like, I do GRC, and one of those processes is on-call processes. And I'm very candid to the business. If you do not unsilo this role, then you will suffer availability consequences, right? If I'm put in a role silo and I get burnt out, sorry, I'm gone. I'm human, right? And I'm not going to be subject to be in a role silo and to be subject to that burnout, as so many CISOs are. I think we're in demand, guys. Like, let's stand up for ourselves a little bit and demand that we have backups, that we have deputies, that we have processes in place that mitigate the sole dependency on us and of our individual employees. Role silos are a very serious abuse of human resources, and we should we talk about it every couple of years, right? But we need to act really, and part of acting is just about standing up for ourselves individually.
Yeah, I will say one of the best lessons I learned in incident management is, in 1 hour of an incident, you have to decide to send people home. Because you have to be able to predict if the incident will last more than 8 hours. And if it's going to, you have to pick your second shift and send them home to sleep. Because in 8 hours, you're going to have people who are actually making bad decisions, which is, I think, one of the unheralded things. I've talked to a lot of CISOs who work for companies. They're like, no, everybody stays on deck and is working. And I'm like, yeah. And how often do you have somebody who does like a 20-hour shift, beating their head against a wall, passes out, wakes up, and solves the problem in 20 minutes? Like, if you'd sent them home earlier, maybe you would have gotten the solution a little earlier too. Yeah,
Ralph and I, when we worked together, I think he was working there when this happened, but there was a VP at the time who later became the CIO, who was on a call for 72 hours because of a site outage that was caused by a security incident. In that 72 hours, the business that was affected dropped its search engine response page ordinality by a single ranking for number 1, number 2, which has a 30% traffic referral impact. That 30% referral impact caused a 30% loss in income without any operational expense alleviation. So, but I don't care. I don't own that business. I didn't make the decision that would make me depend on somebody to be on the phone for 72 hours. That's asinine. But he did it. He did it voluntarily. God bless him. But I won't.
Yeah, that's kind of amazing. And I think on that note, that's a great spot for us to wrap up. And I know that we promised our audience some findings So first, I want to thank the delightful panelists today for taking time out of your busy schedules to share your learnings. So thank you all. I think as an industry, we can always improve, and hearing these stories sometimes help us do that. So we're going to wrap up our panel, and I'm going to turn you back over to John Alexander, who's going to wrap up with some of the learnings Orca had from looking across our entire customer base.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Andy. And again, I want to just thank everybody, Helen, Jack, and Ralph, Andy. You guys all did an incredible job. So I had a little bit more stats, but I pulled a few just because they weren't very interesting. Just wanted to, I think sometimes less is more. And I actually ordered them in this way for a reason. But the most interesting stat of all four of them is actually the second stat. But I put the first one stat for a reason. So let's go over the first stat. We're looking at on December 23rd and then January 23rd, 1 month, exactly 1 month later. And the first stat looks a little bit odd. Customers found, still have one instance of Log4j in their environment, 75%, and then 68. Well, the issue is we're looking for just one, right? If we look for a different number, it would be different. So what that's really telling me, it's hard to completely eradicate Log4j just because you can't, right? And there is mitigations for Log4j. So a lot of people, had to mitigate because they couldn't patch, right? So not really surprising once you have the context. The second thing backs that up. What really highlights is, when people can see the stuff, they did a great job. They really, they basically moved, from 20% of stuff being in closed state immediately to 75%. And that, for you that haven't done security, that may not sound that great, but in a security world, that is the excellent job done by enterprises on that. And it just shows that they moved quickly. There was mitigations. It is like Helen, Jack, Ralph, and Andy said, a vulnerability that was everywhere. So incredible job by people moving forward. Then the last two stats that talk about interfacing assets really kind of back up the second point. It's just a really hard vulnerability to completely patch and get rid of. So mitigations happened, right? People knew where this thing was. When you have the right software, you know where the things are and you make decisions. And again, the one nice thing about Log4j is there was mitigations as well as patching. So there was alternatives that people followed. So generally a well done job. It will be interesting to see what happens a month later, 2 months later on Log4j, but in general, the reactions overall, and this is a good statistically sample that's statistically relevant as far as that goes. So a good sampling on the industry on how Log4j was handled. I guess we have everybody. If anybody wants a quick comment, maybe just one of you can comment a little bit quickly if anybody wants to jump in and comment about the stats. But overall, I just say just a well done job overall by our customers and the community in handling Log4j.
Look at that, the difference between that internet-facing assets and just the presence of Log4j. One of the things that sold me on Orca right away is when I looked at the way that they granularized the risk and considered other factors to determine if an asset was more vulnerable than another. And just simply categorizing something as internet-facing, right, as a imminent compromise versus something much lower is incredibly useful because it immediately helps me prioritize things just like that. And I think that these statistics kind of represent that pretty clearly.
Great. Thanks, Jack. I think that goes. I just want to again thank everybody. Great panel, and that concludes this seminar panel.
And thanks, everybody. We appreciate your time for coming. And if you're interested in a free cloud security risk assessment, quickly assess whether your environment still has any Log4j around or other vulnerabilities, you can go to orca.security.